afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real pleasure to speak with you today on cities, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the focus of my presentation is on sustainability and local governments. I will briefly look at these points in the agenda, but specifically focusing on action and what could be done and what is being done at the moment. I would like to start with these two quotes, which came from Antonio Guterres, as well as Francesco Camera. As you know, Mr. Guterres is the Secretary General of the United Nations, and coming from a quote from the New York Times, a time to save the sick and rescue the planet. And this is, for me, a really interesting perspective. He also links and makes the connection between the COVID pandemic and how we can deal with climate change. And clearly, we cannot self-isolate ourselves from the disrupting devastation that will be coming from climate change, but also learning from these lessons on how we deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. If we look at the IRENA Director General, his focus is energy, staying on course, renewable energy in the time of COVID-19, and he focuses very much on the stimulus and recovery packages to accelerate the shift to decarbonize our economies and make resilient and inclusive societies. And I think these capture very much the essence of what local governments are also looking for. For those of you who do not know the organization I work for, ICLE, name ICLE, Local Governments for Sustainability. We're a global network of many local and regional governments that are committed to sustainable development. And our aim is really to focus on influencing policy and action, looking at low emission, nature-based solutions, equitable, resilient, and circular development. And for us, these are entry points which would enable us to scale up and accelerate sustainable development. And we work together with a team of multidisciplinary experts around the world to create systemic change for sustainability. The 5 pathways that I just mentioned are literally entry points, which also all of these relate to the people, who we are, the place we live in, the cities, the communities. It relates to the policies, it relates to financing and everything that we can create space to enable action for systemic change and looking at integrated, holistic, sustainable development. Now, when you look at an urban system, mostly when we talk about cities, these could be towns or smaller communities or mega cities, there are so many activities happening in and around these, and especially bringing together many different types of stakeholders, citizens, NGOs, businesses, industry, different levels of government. It's a complex system, and now we have the overlay of the pandemic, which interrupts also the work happening in those systems. Now, when we look at the way we need to deal with things, one needs to look beyond your own particular boundaries of your city or town, looking at the territory, your neighbors, the communities who could also work together, and making these urban-rural linkages on how to address things together in maybe in a solidarity approach as well. When we focus on the topic, specifically looking at local governments, they have many different roles to play, but basically they administer a very specific geographical area. They offer many different services to the community. Quite often they're responsible for schooling, for health clinics, for policing, things like that, really practical things that have now been interrupted or are being affected by the COVID pandemic, but are also going to be and already are affected also by climate change. The interesting part is we are in a space where at the city level, in a city town, the local government is keen to explore socio-economic opportunities, to create opportunities for the citizens. And as ICLE, we recommend that they look at sustainable development as the core approach, also having a holistic and inclusive approach, looking at the vulnerable, the people who are not necessarily empowered, who should not be left behind. And now when we have the COVID-19 and the need for climate action, the urgency to address health and the safety of people and our environment is even more in the foreground than it is normally. But it also makes us think about things where we need to maybe improve our approach. Typically, local governments do short to long-term planning. They do emergency response and disaster risk management planning. And probably what we need to do here in this particular case is to strengthen how that planning takes place before there are any emergencies or crises, and making sure that the implementation and monitoring of the impacts can lead to the results that they intend. Working together with different levels of government in this particular case as well, where health is typically, again, a national or a federal level area of responsibility, but there are decentralized responsibilities and mandates. So this requires working together. But clearly the planning has to be implemented at an earlier level and be able to be implemented effectively and accelerate action if your plans do not work. When we're looking at the space of local governments, they have to improve and implement policy, look at regulations, their organizational structures, working with stakeholders, selecting appropriate technologies, how to finance all of the work that needs to be done, themselves have their capacity built and awareness raised, but also doing that with their community stakeholders. This is an incredibly complex space, even without COVID-19 or even without climate change. And I want to stress the fact that this is an area where a holistic approach would also make sense to be able to deal with all the topics that a local government also has to look at. These are just a snapshot of some topics, but these are the key ones that also now relate to the current situation we're in. We need to make sure that there is energy to people, that they have places to live, that they're not kicked out of their apartments or places where they cannot pay their rent, that there is public transit. All of these services need to keep on in times of crisis. And how do we deal with this? A couple of examples that I wish to show you, and literally these are just a few. There are so many amazing examples of how local governments have dealt with the situation and are busy dealing with the situation. But the focus on this slide is looking at the immediate and necessary prioritization. So if you look at your current work experience, the first example looking at local government climate and sustainability staff who speak up around the uncertainty of their work in the crisis, many local government staff have had a complete change in their day-to-day work, where there is a significant change to the programming, to their budgets, to their normal operations. Some have been pulled into dealing with the COVID crisis and are part of the frontline experiences. Some are doing office support work, making sure systems and procedures work and remain in place, while others have been sent home because they cannot be part of the crisis space. What I do like about this example from the US specifically is that a couple of cities have very much focused on vulnerable populations and cybersecurity in the space where the internet and where our virtual communication space has become critical. If we look at the second topic, there are how COVID-19 is affecting the work of local government sustainability officers. 3 cities have shared experiences. One, Umshatuze from South Africa, where they have in the planning department switched that all applications are online and there are no more in-person consultations. This is to protect the community and the staff, of course, but it actually also leads to a change in the IT space of the local government, where they must make sure that they can offer these services online. In Orlando, Florida, unfortunately, they had to postpone all the in-person meetings and activities around Earth Day activities. But again, the online and virtual space has probably been extremely active. If we look at the example of Turku in Finland, they have stopped their social media campaigns on climate change for the moment and switched these to questions dealing on hygiene and how to the online learning and sharing options. So again, a complete shift in the work of the day-to-day work that they're doing, and a necessary switch as well. If we look at sustainable economic development, these questions are coming up now quite interesting and very strongly from many leaders around the world, where we are seeing the reducing greenhouse gas emissions, because our activities globally have shifted and changed. We're not traveling that much, we're not flying anymore. Emissions have reduced, air quality has improved, but it also leads to the questions, are we now, in this time of crisis, can we reconsider when the crisis is over? How can we look at a more sustainable approach that we can also afford from an environmental perspective, not going back to the normal way of dealing with things, but really looking at clean energy, switching ideally to 100% renewables, making sure the public transit is clean, free, for allowing people, including the vulnerable, the poor, those who do not have funding, to reach their workspaces. Many new interesting questions can now be asked and are being discussed as we speak. I personally work in the space also of energy, so I think the second example here, putting clean energy at the heart of the stimulus plans to counter the coronavirus impact, I think is an extremely important space where especially national and federal governments, as well as other levels of government, now have an opportunity to design and influence stimulus plans that make sure that we can go to a low carbon economy, and making sure that we have a secure and sustainable energy future. The time is ripe at the moment. As we've seen, we can reduce our energy demands, we can reduce pollution activities, and in this particular case, if we push for clean and green approaches now, ideally one can embed that into the economic development plans of all the countries. If we look at the last topic, COVID-19 providing lessons for climate adaptation for cities. Of course, adaptation and climate resilience, as well as resilience to these kinds of disasters, is a key component of every level of government administration, where they need to be prepared. They need to anticipate as far as is reasonably possible. But what we've seen now is that we can learn how to bring the climate policy and the virus response and bring the best examples together, because there is clearly a win-win potential. The Columbia University in this case also stressed the interesting part of, in the coronavirus space, policies have focused on people more so than ever before. So many cities have, for example, closed roads and made them pedestrian or bicycle lanes because the cars were no longer on the road. So one can repurpose infrastructure like streets. One can make safe spaces where people can come together, green areas, very different opportunities that we see in this possible space. If you click on the links, and I hope my presentation will be available, these links take you to much more depth of information than I can give you in this short period of time. I want to focus now on a space that is an opportunity and offers an opportunity for policymakers, for decision makers, academia, research institutions, as well as practitioners. Here we can work together in a space called Innovate for Cities. Again, the entry point is climate, but we're also dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic in this and sharing with local governments how they can engage. Now, what is Innovate for Cities? This is a space that was created after we created the Global Research and Action Agenda. And Jan mentioned this when he kindly introduced me, where it was essentially called the Cities IPCC conference, but the focus is on how cities and climate change and the work there can be scaled up to bring these different people together who typically work in silos. Practitioners don't necessarily connect to policymakers. Academia typically don't speak to practitioners. So we need to get this space moving. And you see a lovely partnership here dealing with all kinds of topics as it relates to cities and climate change. And we took this in the Innovate for Cities, pulled together a research and innovation agenda for cities, and we are now scaling up to try and get academia, governments, the private sector, and cities to work together, identify opportunities, generate more knowledge together to feed this research agenda, and in turn scale up climate action. When we say climate action, this is action in all the sectors that I mentioned before: energy, water, waste, transport, looking at air quality, looking at health, looking at nature-based solutions, biodiversity, you name it. The city space is a very nice space where all of this comes together. In our research agenda, we have a couple of key points for city action, from urban planning and buildings, as well as energy, food, waste, and water, but also the policy and finance instruments. We need to know and better understand what works well, where are the good practice cases, how to replicate good practice into other spaces. How can we better work with the vulnerable, with governance? What is good governance in this context? A lot of work that has been done can feed into this space and can help us learn and better deal with the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as with climate change. Here is a call to action for every single group that we probably have on this webinar. National governments are called on to invest into this research and innovation space and make sure that the priorities include city priorities. The private sector is, of course, indispensable. We need them to provide the services, the materials, the tools that can also benefit the public, and while working with local and regional governments. Academia, of course, we need massive amounts of people who can step into that professional space. So we need universities to update their curriculum, incorporating all these things that we're busy exploring and learning as we speak into their training profiles, so that the future generation can also step into the space more easily and with a great deal of knowledge before they actually start officially working in a very complex space. Last but not least, cities and local governments need to fully embrace the leadership and scale up and accelerate climate action. I want to give one opportunity before I nearly close. We are organizing a conference called Daring Cities in this year. It will be a series of conferences every year to really bring the leaders together. Know, act, and lead. It was planned for June. Due to the virus, we'll probably postpone this to October, so watch that space. The link is there. This is where we're going to bring together dialogue between different levels of government. Local leaders will be sharing what are they doing in the space of climate change and being more resilient and tackling challenges like the one we're facing at the moment. There are some wonderful resources online. I'm pointing you to a few ones from ICLE, a webinar series. We yesterday had a lovely webinar on recovering from the pandemic, working with New York City, engaging there, and Local 2030. And I share the link with you. There's some very interesting messaging that we're and hearing from the people in the front lines who also understand and have faced the risks and the well, I think also seeing the social communities and the getting together of people who stand together and make sure that we can actually work in a space where we can heal and progress. So thank you very much, and handing over to you, Gian.